buy stuff, right? You want to go to the mall, you want to go to restaurants, you need a certain amount of money in your pocket.
All right. Hello there. I'm going to do something a little different today. I was watching some of my old streams, not some of them, just one of them really. I realized that as far as content that you can listen to in the background or whatever, which I think is primarily what people do now, um, when you're working on other stuff, doing other stuff, it was pretty boring because, there are times when I'm playing the game where nothing's really going on that requires me to comment, and I could just sit here like a person with ADHD and just start just saying random stuff, but I don't like to do that, I don't like to talk when there's no reason to. So we're gonna do something a little different. We're gonna combine gaming with reacting to what I thought might be some interesting videos. So I picked a few videos that were, cultural commentary stuff, politics, some informational stuff. And we'll be kind of listening into that while I'm playing at the same time, and I'll make some commentary on it. I think that's the way to go. Um, Give me just a moment. I want to get the YouTube chat set up. There's got to be an easier way to do this so that I don't have to like manually enter this in every time, right? Because that can get kind of annoying pretty quickly. I mean, it already is annoying. Where do I find... I guess do I have to go to my actual channel? Here, we'll go to my channel. Am I able to subscribe to myself? I guess the answer is my question. That's a no. That'd be kind of funny. Am I able to subscribe to myself? I guess the answer is my question. That's a no. That'd be kind of funny. Also, kind of curious because I know that you can copy your URL for your YouTube chat into like your OBS stream. But I'm gonna have a my bad. I was just thinking I'm probably gonna have a double up on the audio for that little portion. Yeah, so I was wondering when you copy your URL into your OBS stream, is there a way? Because it seems like when I copy and paste it in, I get my bad. I get top chat rather than live chat, and I'd rather have like all the comments pop up, right? I don't know how that would work with the stream that has pretty much no one watching. I mean, does it show up? I don't even see it. Oh yeah, it does. Okay. All right, cool. All right. So first of all, I wanted to get a refresher on how the Federal Reserve Bank works. I looked into this a while ago and I read about it, and then it all kind of went in one ear and out the other. Or I don't really remember it that well, so I figured we can get another crash course. This is useful information that most people don't really seem to know at all.
Or in your checking account to turn around and buy things. The second reason why you actually need money is because you prefer having money liquid.
I want to see how the audio comes through. Pretty low on the YouTube. So let's turn that up real quick. Let's try that again. Pretty low.
Assets as opposed to having some different assets, for example, bonds or real estate.
Let's try that again. Pretty low.
Assets as opposed to having some
okay.
different assets, for example,
pretty much
bonds
perfect right
or
there.
real estate.
Let's start this over again.
Hey, how you doing? It's Mr. Clifford. This is ACDC Econ. We're talking about monetary policy. All right, the key graph you absolutely have to know is right here, the money market. It's going to be the supply and demand.
Actually, let me pause this real fast. I need to actually read what's going on with this update. So this is a new update. Okay, what is new? Dynamic encounters continue expanding across the galaxy in the update. What's a dynamic encounter? Earn unique rewards, complete achievements, blah blah blah. Capital worlds. Veterans like a great reason to discover or return. Okay, play now. Earn brand new rewards. Okay. Hundreds of new skin tones. Oh, really? Jesus. After I've already made my characters? Great. Sith Pureblood, Nautilin. Okay. Create a new character or head to appearance designer. Check them out. What's new? Propagate Core XR53. Master mode now available. Okay. I don't know what all that means, but alright. That's coolio. Alright, let's start this over again. So he was talking about supply and demand from what I heard.
Hey, how you doing? It's Mr. Clifford. This is ACDC.
Doing awesome,
We're
thank
talking
you.
about monetary policy. All right, the key graph you absolutely have to know is right here. It's the money market. It's going to be the supply and demand for money. Okay, let's start off by analyzing demand. There's only two reasons why people actually demand money. The first one is for transactions. You want to go buy stuff, right? You want to go to the mall, you want to go to restaurants, you need a certain amount of money in your pocket or in your checking account to turn around and buy things. The second reason why you actually need money is because you prefer having money, liquid assets.
I need like a keyboard shortcut. I'm sure that's what all the pros use, right? Keyboard shortcuts to like pause videos and whatnot. So this is something kind of interesting. I've never really thought about supply and demand curve for money. Like obviously I'm aware of supply and demand. You know, I think something that a lot of people don't consider is that labor is also, you know, also behaves, or yeah, it follows, whatever. You have supply and demand for labor too, and I think that's something people usually don't super duper consider. But I've never really thought about supply and demand for money. But I mean, it makes sense, of course, right? You have investments, you have loans. Loans are a form of demand for money. I've never really thought about it or the implications of it. So let's listen to the rest of this, what he's got.
As opposed to having some different asset, for example, bonds or real estate. Wait, we got to define liquidity. Liquidity is the ease in which you can convert an asset into cash. So your checking account is super liquid. All you got to do is walk in the bank and switch out your money, right? Real estate, on the other hand, is not very liquid. It's an asset, but it takes time to sell it, and so it's not a very liquid asset.
Liquidity.
All right, let's analyze the graph. Over here is the interest rate. That's the price of using money. All right, watch this. If the interest rate is super high, I'm telling you that the quantity demanded of money is going to be low. And here's why. When the interest rate is high, do you prefer to have money in your pocket? Prefer having money in bonds earning you money? Well, the answer is in bonds, right? At 20% interest rate, I'd rather have no cash on me in my checking account, and I'd rather go buy some bonds, right? At a low interest rate, let's say 1%, the quantity demanded, it doesn't matter, I'll have money in my pocket, right? I'm not going to go buy bonds with it. So I'd rather have all my money in liquid assets as opposed to having my money in bonds at a super low interest rate because I'm not getting a very high return. This is the demand.
I've never really thought about
now,
that. That's
what
an
about
interesting
the supply?
point.
Who supplies? The Fed. The Fed. Right? The government's the one that supplies money, right? The Fed. Right? So
what is up with that
well,
Fed?
It's a vertical straight line, perfectly inelastic line right here. The reason why it's vertical is because the quantity of money out there, let's say $200 billion, right, is completely unrelated to the interest rate. It's set, it's right there, that's how much we have, that's it. This comes together and it gives you the interest rate, right, the equilibrium interest rate. Now this curve can shift,
okay, hold on
right,
a
if
second.
people's spending habits change.
The money market. So money market is total supply of money. Oh, okay, I see what he's saying. That's not going to change because we have a certain amount of money in the economy at any given time, right? But the demand is what could be, you know, changing on this graph here. I mean, I guess the supply of money can change depending on, would it be the Federal Reserve or the Treasury? Maybe the Treasury, right, issuing bonds?
This demand curve can go up or it can go down. It can shift just like normal demand, right, based on the transaction demand and the asset demand. Let's not focus on demand. Let's focus on the supply.
I like
the
these
key to
droids, by the
understanding
way. These are
monetary
cool
policy
looking.
is understanding interest rates. If you get that, you understand this entire unit. If the Fed increases the money supply, it'll drive down interest rates. And if the Fed decreases money supply, it'll drive up interest rates. All right? So all monetary policy is increasing and decreasing the money supply in an effort to increase or decrease interest rates. Now, you should be asking yourself, well, how do they actually do this? The answer is right here. It's the three Fed tools. These are the three things the Fed can do to adjust the money supply. That right there is the most important thing in monetary policy. The first one is the reserve requirement. The reserve requirement is how much banks have to hold in
I do remember this.
at their bank.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, to put in my own words, exactly what he said, right? It's how much the Federal Reserve expects you to, as a bank, hold in reserve. I think this is by law, right? Um, Now, how does this affect interest rates? Let's think about this for a minute. How would this affect interest rates? How much the bank needs to hold in reserve? I mean, you're pulling money out of the market by doing that, right? And so therefore you're adjusting the supply and demand curve by adjusting the supply curve, right? Or the yeah.
Bank.
Let's see.
For example,
Am I
if you
right?
go put $1,000 in the bank does not keep all $1,000 in the vault somewhere. What it does, it keeps some of it and it loans it out. How much does it keep? The reserve requirement. It's how much the government says the bank has to hold in reserves at the bank. All right, now if the Fed wanted to increase the money supply, what would it do to the reserve requirement? All right, it would decrease the reserve requirement. If the government decreased the reserve requirement, put it, let's say 2%, that means there'd be more money that would be actually loaned out there. To decrease the money supply, they could increase the reserve requirement. Let's say they had banks hold 90%, that would decrease the amount of money that's actually out there. You're going to learn a whole lot more about that concept later on in this unit.
Makes a lot of
sense. Okay, now
sense.
it's time to talk about the discount rate. The discount rate is the interest rate that the Fed charges banks to borrow money. So let's say there's a bank and they haven't cut.
Okay, now he calls it the discount rate. Why do we call it the discount rate? My understanding, I don't remember it being called this, but this would make sense with what I remember about learning about this. You would call it the discount rate because you're not going to be able to beat that rate on the market. And the reason for that is commercial banks, outside of the Federal Reserve, right? Commercial banks need to make some sort of profit on the money that they're loaning out. Right? There needs to be a return on investment to loan the money to you, and then you're paying it back with interest. However, with the Federal Reserve, the United States, they don't really need to. You know what? No, I'm sorry, I'm wrong about this. The real reason is, I think it has to do with the risk, right? The Federal Reserve, I think that's what it is, right? The Federal Reserve doesn't really have what is it? It's like the Federal Reserve doesn't have a risk of not returning that. Um, if you That's what it is. If you take out a loan, let's say in the form of what is it, a security or a bond or whatever, and then you it has a maturity like has a maturity timeline, in which that investment matures, and then you can return it or whatever for you're lending money to the government in a sense in exchange for the security, which is like a promise that um, basically they're going to pay you back with interest. So I had it reversed around, but you're basically loaning the government. There's little to no risk there because we generally expect the United States is going to be stable. It's still going to be around. They're still going to be paying that out. They have to pay it out by law, I believe. And so the interest rate on that can be very low because it's a very low risk um, investment. You know that it's going to pay out. So the commercial banks, they cannot beat this. They can't beat that rate because they do have risk associated with the loan that they give out. They give out loans to businesses, to people, right? The businesses and people may or may not be around. They may or may not pay their bills. They may go into like bankruptcy or something, right? So there's always going to be a risk associated with that loan, and so that loan is always going to be at a higher rate than the rate that the government charges because that risk is factored into the rate of the loan. Let me see if I'm right about that.
Cover their reserve requirement. They need a loan to cover the night to make sure they have that 10%. Well, what happens?
Whoa, what happened?
They can go to the Fed and they can say, I need to borrow some money. That rate they charge them is the discount rate. Let's say the Fed wanted to increase the money supply. What would they do to the discount rate? Well, they would lower it. They'd make money easier to borrow from the Fed, which would increase the money supply. To decrease the money supply, they would increase the discount rate and make it harder for banks to borrow from the Fed. Okay, now it's time for the most important one, open market operations. The reason why this one's the most important is because this is the one the Fed does the most. Open market operations is buying and selling of government treasuries. Right, there's a bunch of treasuries out there. There's a bunch of bonds that the government has issued, right? And the Fed can either issue more or they can buy them back. So if the Fed wanted to increase money supply, should they buy or should they sell bonds? Well, the answer is they should buy. If the Fed buys bonds,
that's right.
They're giving.
And that makes sense because think about it this way, right? when the government is issuing bonds out, you are giving them money, like I said, like a loan, and they're giving you basically this piece of paper that says they're going to pay you back in a certain amount of time. But in exchange for that, right, you've taken money that you have out in the market, you're part of the market, and then the government has a bond. You're exchanging them, right? Now the government's holding the money, you're holding the bond. That money now is not floating around in the market, it's being held. I don't know where they hold it. Is it held in the Federal Reserve or is it held in the Treasury? Either way, it doesn't matter. So that money supply, it's not there anymore. On the flip side, if they want to increase the money supply, they go and they buy back bonds that are out in the market, because these are just pieces of paper right now waiting, right? Just a contract saying they're going to get paid back. The government's holding this money, so when they buy their own bonds back, they're getting the bonds back and they're putting money back into the hands of businesses, people who hold bonds, people who are actually out in the market, right?
Giving people money and they're taking the bonds out of the system, right? And when they give the commercial banks money, that now means there's more money out there, more money increases the money supply. Now, that means if they want to decrease the money supply, they're going to sell. They sell bonds. When the Fed sells bonds, they give out bonds and they take money out of the system, right? There's a bond, that's
exactly
not money, we'll take money out of the system, decreasing the money supply. To help you remember whether...
By the way, like, you know, a lot of people, you'll hear them say things like, oh, you know, fuck the Fed, and, you know, they're all just playing, like, these money games and stuff, and blah, 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 right? And, I mean, I don't know how true any of those complaints are. You know, I don't want to say that there's no merit to them. You know, there might be a way that there's some merit to it. Most of the time when I hear people say that, they don't really understand how any of this works whatsoever, right? And when you actually learn about it, it's actually really quite clever, I think, the way that all this works. It just makes so much sense. Yeah, I mean, just kind of applying like supply and demand, and you know, I kind of like it in the sense that it's not really, because I think some people think like, oh, the government takes money and they burn it, or it's like magic, they just print money. It's not exactly what's happening, right? Because the money is still there. It's either the government's holding onto it, right, or they're selling stuff in order to, or they're buying back their own bonds in order to put the money that was already in the market at one point back in. Or I guess potentially, I don't know if they can just print money in order to buy back their bonds. Probably, I would assume that that might be the case.
Increases or decreases the money supply. I got a trick, right? Buy big, right? If the Fed buys bonds, it makes the money supply bigger. If they sell them, sell small. All right? It'll make the money supply smaller. Okay, now it's time to see how this thing's connected to aggregate demand. Till next time.
Next time? What the hell?
Ready to invest like a pro?
With Robinhood Legend, you can quickly build custom layouts
Why do
and
I
get
feel like
real-time
that
data.
voice is dubbed over? No, that's just me. Macro 4.6. Bro, I don't want like... Man, I don't want a whole series. I just want like a quick breakdown. AC/DC, huh? Let's try this Wall Street.
With inflation hovering around its highest rate in 40 years, the Federal Reserve is expected to raise interest rates several times in 2022. This is Fed Chairman Jerome Powell on what will be needed to ensure a long economic expansion.
That's going to require the Fed to tighten interest rate policy and do our part in getting inflation back down to our 2% goal.
The way the central bank does this is by changing the federal funds rate, its main tool for managing the economy. You can see on this chart that the rate was lowered to nearly 0% in 2020 to boost the economy at the beginning of the pandemic.
There is an important job for us to move away from these very highly stimulative monetary policy settings.
Adjustments to the federal funds rate influence a range of borrowing costs, from how much you owe on your credit card to mortgage rates. They also shape broader decisions made by companies, like how many people to hire or whether to raise prices. Here's how the federal funds rate works, and how just one rate can guide the entire economy.
The Fed meets every 6 or
Everybody
so
knows
weeks,
they're like a good,
and they're looking at a range of economic data at those meetings.
like
But they have two
economics
main goals.
YouTuber.
One is to ensure stable prices and low inflation, and the other is to make sure that the labor market is strong.
Nick Timmeros covers how the Fed guides the
I don't want to
economy
hear all
through
these stories and these like pretty pictures that you have. I just want you to get to the point. Okay, we're gonna skip this for another time. I have to actually find like a decent video, and I have no idea what's a good video on. Actually, this one, at least I could see in the little thumbnail that they have the actual tools that I recognize from when I studied this: interest on reserves, reverse purchase agreements, quantitative easing. So let's try this one and see what this one.
During the Great Recession, several factors about the economy changed, and the Fed needed new instruments and policies to continue to be effective. Specifically, falling interest rates and acute problems in some specific parts of the American economy meant that some of the earlier primary tools, like open market operations, they were not going to be very effective.
Are we going to talk about
As a result, the Fed used quantitative easing, acquired the ability to pay interest on reserves, and began conducting repurchase and reverse repurchase agreements. Now, those are big terms, new concepts.
Okay,
we're going to go through them one by one, but overall, those were ways of influencing the economy during and after the Great Recession. First, to stimulate the economy following the crash of 2008, the Fed conducted a kind of quantitative easing. That term can be used in somewhat different ways, but often it means that the Fed
My understanding of quantitative easing, I'm probably wrong about this based on how he was starting that sentence. My understanding of it was that you're kind of deferring payment on debt. Some along those lines until the next year, so it doesn't really show up on the balance sheet for the current year. I feel like I'm totally wrong about that. That's like the layman dumbed down version.
Money for assets other than T-bills. Recall now that T-bills are the shortest term and most liquid of government securities. By choosing additional types of assets to purchase and not just T-bills, well, that allows the Fed to affect different interest rates, longer-term interest rates, and to target particular parts of the economy. For instance, the Fed may target mortgage securities or other assets with longer maturities than T-bills, and again, that helps the Fed lower longer-term interest rates rather than just shorter-term rates. In addition, by purchasing, say, mortgage securities, the Fed can help to ensure that lower interest rates also translate into lower mortgage interest rates, and that will help out home buyers and, one hopes, spur the purchase and creation of new homes. Quantitative easing also increases the bank's supply of reserves and thus liquidity. Since 2008, excess reserves in banks have increased from about $2 billion to $2.7 trillion. Changing the...
You know, I believe this is what people mean when they say that. Like, I think a lot of people have this misunderstanding that the U.S. is in debt and like we're going to go into bankruptcy or something like that. And I don't know, maybe that does happen at some point. But part of the misunderstanding, at least in the way that people generally talk about it, is a lot of them think that we like are indebted to like China and like all these foreign countries, and they're going to call in the debt, and then it's going to crash our economy, which doesn't really make sense for a country like China that holds our debt, because if they hold our debt and then they crash our economy, then they're not going to get paid back, right? Doesn't really make sense. But all that said, most of the debt that the government has is actually owned by other Americans, either companies or whatnot. And I think it's in the form of treasury bonds and whatnot. And so, my bad, I kind of lost my train of thought there, but had something to do with what he was saying. If we're talking about quantitative easing. Anyways, let's continue.
The supply of reserves and the federal funds rate, as the Fed did through open market operations, well, that no longer was going to be so effective in boosting loans. Keep in mind, in this new environment, banks had so many reserves, they had enough reserves for all their lending requirements. Furthermore, with banks...
Why do they need reserves for their lending requirements? Oh, I think, doesn't this goes back to the rule that we were talking about earlier in the other video, right? Which is that by law, the government requires them to hold a certain amount in reserves, and that's in order to let's see, if they're holding treasury bonds in reserves, then those reserves are increasing the money supply, right? So is that what the Fed is doing there? It's increasing the money supply by having banks hold reserves?
Banks holding so many excess reserves, the federal funds market.
Or flipped it the other way around. It's decreasing the money supply by forcing the banks to purchase securities, treasury bonds, reserves, right? And so then the government exchanges that for money that they're taking out of the economy.
Market just wasn't so big or so important anymore. And again, the Fed had to look for other tools. Additionally, and this is quite important, interest rates, they've been falling for a long time, and in recent years, they've been especially low. At times, the short rate has been at or very close to zero in a lot of parts of the world. Exactly why this has been occurring is a subject of debate, but the end result is that interest rates in the American economy...
Because I do remember these, this is 7 years old, that makes a lot of sense. Let's see, 7 years ago, that was before the COVID recession. Yeah, for a long time there was debate about if we were living kind of like a post-inflationary period, because our interest rates were so low for so long, and yet we weren't seeing rampant inflation. And I even believed at one time that, hey, maybe we could live in a society or whatever where you could just essentially give out money for free and you wouldn't have inflationary effects, right? And my thought process was, maybe our economies have become so advanced that we're so good at ramping up production and being able to produce goods and stuff that even if you increase the money supply, therefore increasing the demand, like our economy is just so able to supply for that demand without there being like huge inflation. Because inflation would be like, in simpler terms, right? More money chasing fewer amounts of goods, or yeah, a lot of dollars chasing not as many goods, something along those lines. And so, if you're giving out free money, you're increasing demand because people want to use that money to buy things with, right? And so then companies out there that are running lean, they're already producing at capacity. How able are they to increase their capacity to supply for that demand? Because otherwise they're just gonna raise prices. If there's a lot more demand for the same amount of supply, then they're gonna raise the cost of their goods. But if they're able to ramp up production to supply more for that demand, then the supply and demand are increasing, let's say at the same rate, then you're not going to see inflation, right? So I think for a long time people believed, I think maybe that's what was going on. And then COVID happened, and the global economy, like every country basically did a lot of stimulus, and we actually did see inflation. We saw inflation around like 9-10%. I don't know if any countries got above 20s, which I think kind of told us that no, we're not really in that kind of economy. I think it's probably fair to say that our economy probably in 2025 versus something like the 1900s probably is better at increasing supply to match demand, but probably only up to a certain point, right? There's probably a threshold on how much you can increase the demand before companies reach their limits to actually supply that without incurring a lot of inflation.
For a considerable number of years, we're very close to zero, at least for short-term low-risk investments. That means that a swap of zero-interest cash for near-zero-interest T-bills, well, that might not really have significant macroeconomic effects. So, instead of focusing solely on asset swaps, the Fed also tries to change the demand for reserves. But to do this, the Fed had to acquire a new tool, the ability to pay interest on bank reserves held at the Fed. Suppose, for instance, that the Fed wants to pursue a relatively contractionary policy, as was the case in late 2015.
By
this can help you see.
He means, I believe he means pulling money out of the economy, contracting the money supply, right? Which would also in turn, reduce growth by reducing demand, because there's less money in the market chasing goods.
See how paying interest on reserves might make monetary policy more effective. Well, the Fed now takes its new tool, that rate of interest on reserves, and it raises that rate of interest. That increases the bank demand for reserves.
Right? Because if the Fed is offering securities at a higher interest rate, treasuries, there might be a difference between these. I don't really know. I'm sure there is, but forgive me for my ignorance when I'm speaking on this. But yeah, if they're going to increase interest, hold on a second. Cutscene time. Like those red troopers.
You're too late. The detonite charges are in
That's on that.
Even you won't be able to stop them all in time.
You underestimate fire.
Can't stop me, Kranis. I'm ending this.
We're all going to die here. The difference is, I'll live again.
Why would you live again? What kind of sense does that make? Check out that lightsaber. Whoa, where are my Jedi instincts at? I saw the grenade and I just kind of stood there and took it. Who's this dude? I mean, do I open fire on the Imperials? Glad you can make it. No, let's have a little bit of patience.
Better late than never. It's over, Kranis. Don't be a fool. Surrender.
For the Emperor's glory, die and be reborn.
Where does he get this idea he's gonna be reborn? Where does this come from? For those of you that don't really know Star Wars lore, only Jedi can really transform into the Force and essentially live forever, I guess. As kind of an irony of the Sith is that the Jedi don't necessarily want to live forever, right? It's kind of like a selfish desire to have. The Sith often do. They either, desire unlimited power or to like live forever, right? And as far as I know, the Sith cannot become Force ghosts. They can't transform into the Force. You have to be in harmony with the Force in order to live on through the Force after death. So it's funny because the Jedi can attain that, the Sith can't, and yet the Jedi are not the ones who want to, and the Sith are the ones who do want to. I wouldn't call it a tragic irony, I'd call it whatever the opposite of a tragedy is. It's like a good irony. Okay, what am I supposed to do here? Disarm detonate charges. I like that, detonate. It's like unobtainium. How do I disarm this thing? Is it down here? What the hell are the controls at? I like how this game will just reuse animations. Like, that's the little animation that he does when he's supposed to be, like, touching computer controls, right? He's just, like, out in the air, just doing it randomly. Okay, so there's 4 of these. I like how they're just kind of, like, randomly placed. Like, you don't have one at each of these things. Where's the 4th one at? I gotta go up here, maybe? Maybe, baby, just put it under the tree. Okay. Oh, here we go. You know what this reminds me of? Any of you played Halo 2? There's that, like, Covenant bomb at the beginning. It's kind of shaped like a football. Kind of looks like a football. Like a weird football. Do they still make those basketballs that have like the pump that's built into it, where you like push the thing and it pops out and you pop it? Such a great idea, by the way, right? From like an engineering perspective, so clever. But do they make footballs that do that too? Kind of curious. Do they make soccer balls that do that? I need a nice soccer ball. I don't even know what I would do with it. It's not like I get out and play much soccer anymore.
Colonel Bartek?
Pac Taldine. Didn't I meet this dude? I'll go mute the call and now tell her to call me. I mean, honestly, he's probably going to say that, no, he can't over here because it's wiretap, so he's stupid.
With Kranis out of the way, I think I can spare a few moments.
Don't tell him I'm going to go all the way to the main Republic base, only for her to tell me to come all the way back out here again. I bet you anything that's what's going to happen. Just like typical MMO, busy work, go here, do this, go hit there, do that. Rinse and repeat over and over again. Alright, let's get back into this though.
And it also places upward pressure on other short-term interest rates. Since banks can now earn a higher interest rate on reserves held at the Fed, they're less willing to lend at market interest rates, and you
Okay, that makes sense to me, right? Because if the Fed is increasing their rate, then I'm assuming these guys are also going to increase their rates as well.
See that this new instrument can have some effects on the macroeconomy. So
yeah, which means that individuals, businesses, and whoever this lady is, they're not going to want to do things like go out and buy a car or, you know, take out a loan to buy equipment for their business, right? Because the interest rates are now high, so we're contracting the growth of the economy.
Even a fairly low rate of interest paid on reserves, that can encourage banks to hold a lot more reserves at the Fed, since it can be hard for banks to find superior returns elsewhere at a comparable level of risk. Finally, the Fed expanded its influence through repurchase and reverse repurchase agreements.
Okay,
now, this requires a bit of explanation. A repurchase agreement is an overnight loan or swap of central bank dollar reserves.
Okay, so I always remember they talked about like the overnight, like, and I'll be right back. Let me just grab some chips real fast. But I remember they talked about there's like the overnight like desk, like kiosk, where you can exchange, what is it, your treasuries for money again or something? But I don't understand why it has to be like overnight. Like, why not at the point just say like 24/7, or can you only do it overnight? Is there some significance to that?
T-bills. A basic repurchase agreement involves the central bank sending...
Hold on, let's see. Why is it called a overnight repurchase? Because the agreement involves a short term, usually 1 day. Oh, I guess that's what they're saying, is that it turns around in 1 day. So you're saying that, like, you may execute it on, I don't know, May, what day is it? May 29th? And then it's actually executed May 30th. So basically they're saying like the transaction is processing overnight, I think is what they're saying.
Some reserves to the bank and taking back in turn some treasury bills. A reverse repurchase agreement means that the Fed takes on reserves and sends the other parties T-bills. In each case, this is like controlling the money supply in some way. So for instance, a reverse repurchase agreement that drains banks and other financial intermediaries of liquid cash, giving them a higher rate of return on T-bill holdings and discouraging their investment elsewhere.
Same as what we talked about before.
By the way, if you recall the discussion of open market operations from our previous video, well, repurchase and reverse repurchase agreements, they're somewhat similar, except think of these as like ongoing renewable rental deals rather than just a purchase. Also, keep in mind that the Fed has been conducting repos and reverse repos with financial institutions other than just narrowly defined banks. And that's to make sure its tools have sufficient impact throughout the broader economy.
So there's a difference here that the repos, as opposed to open market operations, the repos are specifically with the Federal Reserve banks rather than with commercial lending banks. And I'm assuming open market operations would be commercial lending banks because it's open to the market, right? Let's see real fast. Open market versus repo. Repos are temporary, so are broad category of actions the central bank takes to manage money supply and influence interest rates. Repurchase agreements, repos are a specified type of... Oh, so repos are a type of open market operation. Okay, so open market operations are in the open market. Okay, that makes sense. So I think it is kind of saying that repos are basically taking money out of the commercial or giving money to the. It's between repos are money market, commercial bank. And the repo rate, the difference between open market purchase or sale of government securities treasury. All right, this is getting a little bit too much for me, so we'll skip this for now.
In sum, the Fed implemented some novel instruments when responding to the 2008 crash. They used quantitative easing, they paid interest on reserves, and they conducted repurchase and reverse repurchase agreements, and those are only a few of the things they did. In any case, monetary policy continues to evolve as economic.
All right, interesting. So, the Jordan Peterson versus 20 atheists debate has been popping off, and so has the Charlie Kirk one. So I ran into this one. I thought maybe some of the Jubilee videos, good background noise. I'm listening to background noise, so you can later on listen to background noise. But this is like the reverse. This is like the reverse chimera, right? Instead of one Christian versus 25 atheists, it's one atheist versus 25 Christians.
Could there be a purpose to it?
Did God command the ethnic cleansing of...
Colonel Bartaff, I was told you wanted to see me.
First, let me express my gratitude. Your actions saved many Republic soldiers.
Your special forces were invaluable during the battle with Executor Kranis.
I'll make sure their actions are properly recognized. It isn't every day soldiers are praised by a Jedi. I won't waste your time, but there's something I need you to clear up for me. My forces apprehended this prisoner during the riots. I need to know why one of the galaxy's worst criminals was helping you.
Did I know this guy?
I thought Pack was one of the guards. You're telling me he was one of the inmates?
Doesn't surprise me.
I came here a decade ago as a prisoner.
This guy was shady.
I did things you don't want to know about. Being on Belsavis, surrounded by scum just like me, it opened my eyes. Even if I could never leave here, I could still change. It took years, but I did it. The warden made me an honorary guard. Said I earned that.
Did he? Oh no, man. Kind of have a history of lying.
You kept this a secret from me? You're a liar.
I'm trying to make up for the terrible things I've done. The warden gave me that chance.
So you claim. Unfortunately, we have no evidence to support your story. It's possible the records were destroyed in all the chaos. However, it's also possible you're lying.
Well, let's test him. Put him on duty. Put him on probationary duty. Keep him monitored. See how he behaves.
What were his crimes? Why is Pack in prison for life on Belsavis?
Only the most vicious and dangerous criminals end up here. Take the worst crimes you can imagine and multiply them by 1,000.
1,000, huh?
I'm not like that anymore. I helped you.
Now you see my dilemma. I don't want to imprison someone who doesn't deserve it, but I don't want to set a criminal free.
I like how this is a light side option. I mean, we really don't know whether or not he's lying or not. He could be set free and then go around raping and killing people. So would that really be a light-sided option?
If the warden made Pack a guard, someone knows about it. Keep him in a holding cell until you find the truth.
That sounds reasonable. Pack, You'll stay here until we get this all straightened out.
Guess it's better than going back into Gen Pop.
I'm sure you have business elsewhere. Thank you again for everything you did here.
I was gonna say she's a cutie, but then again, like everybody in this game's a cutie because, you know, they're all idyllic model faces and whatnot. Oh, wait a second, I got another one of these? The hell? Looks just like my other one. What level am I at now? 50. Got to pop that XP boost. I don't even have an XP boost to use.
Thank you for your patronage.
Okay, am I all done? Oh, I'm finally done on Belsavis. It's about fucking time, my god. I mean, it's my fault. I took on story missions that I usually don't take on. See, if you're watching one of these for the first time, basically, I'm trying to like finish up all my character class storylines so I can move on, because the DLC content is like, it's just better. It's better written, better produced in terms of like planet design, character design, stuff like that. I realized that when I finished the character storyline for one of my other characters and like went to the DLC planets, I was like, oh my god, this is so much better. What am I doing? Spending so much time doing every single mission on every planet for all my characters when most of the missions are like throwaway missions I need to just speed through. So, yeah. To be honest with you, I forgot why I even brought that up in the first place. Oh yeah, that's why. Because I haven't actually done too many of the planet missions on Belsavis before, and I thought it looked like a cool planet to explore. I kind of wanted to see if there's anything interesting here. For the most part, it's basically the same crap as like every other planet. Every planet we reach is dead.
The land of Israel.
Like, I'm not saying the scribe made something up. I'm saying the scribe has a command.
So where did they get that command from?
From God.
I had Jesus appear to me 3 years ago.
I don't know what's happening now. I have to suspect it's some kind of psychological phenomenon. Hi, my name is Alex O'Connor. I'm an atheist and host of the Within Reason podcast. And today...
So polite. Such a genteel, Christian, idyllic young man.
Belsavis is safe.
The galaxy is in your debt once again, but I fear this is far from over.
The Emperor would never devote all his resources to Belsavis. We must find his other targets.
There is a rumor of high-ranking Sith gathering at a remote Imperial space station, allegedly on the Emperor's orders. One of our best scouts volunteered to investigate. He's disappeared.
Okay. My cat has my hand. Thank you.
Rumors are good bait to lure a desperate Jedi.
That, or the rumors are correct. Jomar Chul attempted to infiltrate the Imperial space station where the Sith are meeting, and hasn't checked in since.
Jomar.
Jomar have had differences, but I believe he's onto something.
If the Emperor is involved, this may reveal his plans.
This is worth pursuing.
I'm transmitting coordinates to the space station. I have no advice for getting inside.
Leave that to me.
May the Force be with you.
And also with you. We lift up our hearts. It's good to give praise. I don't know. I was raised Catholic. I vaguely remember we used to repeat that every time I went to church, but I don't remember exactly how it goes. Interesting that we're watching this debate.
I'm surrounded by 25 Christians who,
your boy here is not really Catholic
might be able
anymore.
to change my mind.
Don't really see any reason to me.
My first claim is that suffering makes God's existence unlikely.
That's an interesting claim. I wonder why he's making that claim. Oh, I see. He's gonna make the point that what is this? The tinnitus argument. Tacticus. Tacitus. Tactus. Paradox. Tacitus paradox. Jesus Christ, I can't even find this thing. What's the, No, that's not him. Epicurean. Why was I thinking it was Tactus? But yeah, the Epicurean paradox. That's what he's gonna cut on. See, the thing about like most of these debates that we have even today is that basically these debates have been had decades ago. Sometimes thousands of years ago. These are all old debates, and it's just that people don't really know all the arguments, right? Every new generation that comes along doesn't know about the debates that the previous generation had necessarily, unless they read about it.
Master Jedi, I'm aware that my recent military record might raise some concerns.
Why?
I want to reassure you that my squad fatality rates have not consistently been this high.
So you only lose all of your men some of the time?
The first squad I commanded after making sergeant was sent to free POWs being held at a small Imperial outpost. Intel said the place would be lightly manned. Most of the Imperials wouldn't arrive for another 24 hours. Intel was wrong.
I assume you got more than you bargained for.
The Imperials sent their reinforcements a day early. When my squad broke into the outpost, we were outnumbered 10 to 1. We were outmanned and outgunned, but we achieved our objective, freed all the POWs, and came out alive. My squad's casualty rate was 97.4%, but we had no fatalities.
This dude right here, 97.43251. Oh, I see. I got a little confused for a second there. Casualty versus fatality. I believe casualty just means that you've had injuries. Actually, I'm going to double check that. Casualty versus fatality. There's someone injured. Yeah, injured but not killed. So, I mean, that's not bad.
It's impressive that anyone made it out of there with those odds.
They were good soldiers, far better than any of the others I've had under my command. Our mission was accomplished without permanent loss of Republic resources. That squad was effectively trained, and as a result, we achieved victory much more efficiently.
Then the death tolls are simply a matter of poor resource use?
Good soldiers are a resource. Yes, their loss damages the war effort, but they are meant to be used. Victory for the Republic is worth any cost.
Not any cost. At some point you kind of miss the whole point. It's kind of like the whole Elon thing, right? Technology for technology's sake. The reason we care about technology is because it should benefit humanity, right? When you get to the point where you're sacrificing humanity for either technology or the economy, you miss the entire point. The economy and technology are inanimate, you know, not necessarily objects, but concepts. They don't have any will. They don't have any normative, subjective experience. They don't really care. They're arbitrary things, right? They only really exist to serve humanity. So when you've lost the plot on that, then it doesn't really make any sense anymore.
Master Jedi, our downtime has had a positive impact on my battle readiness. I believe I'm 14.2% more prepared for combat.
This guy. Yeah, I want to know too.
What does that even mean?
Analysis of, well, I won't bore you with the details.
I mean,
a lot of time to think. I've forgotten what that was like.
Hey. You need to get out from under there. No, you're causing problems now. You can relax right here, okay? I don't want you over there because you're causing issues. You're trying to scratch stuff, okay? Chill. Alright? Hey, be gentle. You are hyper right now. You know why? Because you just ate. That's why. You got all this pent-up energy now, huh? You want to be rambunctious? Which part, dummy? That's mean.
Relax while you can, Sergeant. There's more fighting ahead.
I'm looking forward to it.
Looking forward to fighting. Okay.
Original squad. I haven't seen any of them since we liberated that POW camp. They seem to be on active duty, but I can't find any mention of commendations or recognition. They should be decorated soldiers.
Perhaps they're not as good as you thought.
Whoa! Not what I meant.
Impressive than my own. Carson, Nadja, Eckert, that whole squad has simply vanished.
One might almost believe that you considered those soldiers people.
They'd be most valuable to the Republic deployed on the front. This just doesn't make sense to me.
Unlocked all the dialogue trees, huh?
Finally tracked down my old squadmates, Master Jedi, wishing I hadn't. General
Jedi.
recruited them into the Special Forces Black Ops program, but now they're in a detention facility on Beirun, convicted of war crimes.
War crimes are a serious charge. How did your old squad go from being heroes to convicted criminals?
Black Ops doesn't make heroes. It trains killers. If the right targets die, no one complains. They renamed my old squad the Surgeons, tasked them with destabilizing the Empire's command structure by removing its best leaders. But the Surgeons didn't just target Imperial commanders. They went after the officers' families. They wanted to send the enemy a message.
I wouldn't put it past the Empire to frame your old squad.
I wondered the same thing, but the fact is, they all confessed. They're proud of what they did. The detention center's warden says my old squad mates are serving life sentences. They're young. That's a lot of years to spend in cages. The next time I get nostalgic and curious, Master Jedi, give me a planet to invade.
This dude grew on me. I thought he was just a complete asshole when I first met him. But I think some time spent trying to be a civilian for a while might benefit him. Give him a little bit more humanity, right? Like he's seen way too much combat back to back without something else to balance it out.
Only a few dozen senators have access to those accounts. One of them must be an Imperial spy.
Buried in red tape, okay. Well, obviously.
Until we find out who hired the bounty hunter and why, we can't be sure of anything. I never pictured you as a politician.
Damn, speechwriter. Can't imagine how charismatic those speeches would be with all these equals and plus signs.
How did that work out?
Oh, god damn it. I hate this guy.
Old Doc's always been more of a lover than a fighter. But I had to up my game since you came around. It's not easy looking good when you're fighting next to a Jedi, but I figured out the trick.
Care to clue me in before our next big battle?
Let's just say I'm getting a new nickname. Dr. Knockout. Yep. Next time we're surrounded by the scum of the galaxy.
Wonder how much time he spent trying to figure that out. I'm already sorry that I met him. I hate this guy.
I don't believe this. We missed the party of the millennium last night. It's all over the holonet. Music, dancing, attractive people. We could have been a part of it if we hadn't been on the wrong side of the galaxy, saving everyone's lives as usual. 2 heroes of the Republic would have been colossal at that shindig. Infinite opportunities for romance.
Romance? Is that what you call it?
Just think about how much more colossal we'll be at these parties once the Empire is defeated.
We've already earned more admirers than we'll ever have time for. Anything extra is just wasteful. I'm in the prime of my life, and I'm spending it with people who enjoy running around on exploding planets. All I want is to abuse our fame just for one night. Is that so wrong?
Bro, just go. Go do your thing. I don't want you here. I hate this guy.
Your people speaking of the Empire sound like a distorted echo. When I was born, we thought the rest of the galaxy to be mystery and legend. We had been alone for 1,000 years.
What was it like? I can't even imagine.
We were what you made us. In my youth, Jedi were how you threatened errant children. Obey your masters or the Jedi will obliterate you. For thousands of years, we had total control of 100 star systems. Then the Jedi drove us to the farthest fringe of the galaxy.
You're welcome.
The Emperor had subjugated thousands of species. Every non-Force user was enslaved.
They were safe and served to their own capability. This is hardly worth debating. I gain nothing from understanding how your Republic's fools view the galaxy. I am surprised that once your council finishes its brainwashing, any Jedi has a spine left to oppose the Emperor. Perhaps you are young enough to still cultivate the strength of the Sith.
Revan the Exile and I were all Jedi trained. We all resisted the Emperor. What Sith have done so?
That was a surprise. In 3 centuries, I expected to see one test his strength against the Dark Lord. But those strong enough to challenge him are killed young, or co-opted into the Dark Council.
Exactly. There you go.
Jedi strengths are different, necessarily lesser.
I mean, I'm glad he came around to that. I would have expected that too. Need to ruminate? My experience, people don't change their mind that quickly.
To prepare you to face the Emperor. What has your training been? All I know of Jedi ways is from Revan. Surely they have changed in 300 years.
How does someone become the Emperor's wrath?
There has only ever been one. My training as a Sith was not far different than Korriban today. Only my visions set me apart, made them bring me before the Emperor. In his presence, I first saw who he was and what he planned.
Oh, you know what? I just put 2 and 2 together on something, which is that when you play the Sith Marauder character, he becomes the Emperor's Wrath later on in the game. So that makes sense. That would correspond to when he left, so then the position opens up. That's kind of cool, I guess. So only my vision set me apart, made them bring me before the Emperor. In his presence, I first saw who he was and what he planned. Excuse me, sir. He didn't notice? Of course he noticed. He just doesn't care. I mean, none of them really care.
You still chose to serve him.
I chose to live long enough to find one who could defeat him. I thought Revan and the Jedi Exile were my chance.
Revan and the Jedi Exile are legends.
Mitra Surik.
What were they like?
It should not have surprised anyone that Revan turned Sith. He knew you cannot fight the dark side without understanding it. Exile was harder to read. Even with all she had done, she never trusted herself. With Revan, she was his student again. I liked them. I would have served them, but my vision told me they would fail. I cut down the exile and brought Revan to the Emperor as a gift.
What the hell? He killed Miniature Zurg. That's interesting. Wait, does he pop up in Knights of the Old Republic 2? Kodor, Scourge, Kodor 2. Wait, is this him? Holy crap, he looks like shit here. Oh my god. It looks terrible. Actually, look cooler in here. Is this him? No, this is Lord Sion. What the heck? That's so interesting. So, yeah, I mean, I'm so curious. Does he actually show? It looks like he does, right? Huh. Lord Scourge from the KOTOR movie trilogy using Naga Sadow PC head, the Naga Sadow PC head in. Does he? Does he appear in the game? It's interesting. Does Lord Scourge pop up in KOTOR 2? Oh no, he's not in there. So apparently he probably meets them after the events of the game. Whoa! Wrong one.
You regret betraying them. There is room in the Force to forgive even such heinous crimes.
I do not seek forgiveness. The only way to live long enough to find the Jedi who would kill the Emperor, to find you, was to convince him to trust me. He took my offering and gave me a place at his side. He gave me immortality. It was a gift, but not without its price.
Okay, so I mean, I had just assumed that his species, the Sith species, just lived longer because he's like 300 years old, I think is what he said. But it sounds like they artificially increased his lifespan. Kind of curious. Sith species lifespan. Oh no, they typically live 250 years, but some can reach 400 years. So, okay, interesting. All right, I will be right back. Alright. Alright, we're back. Make sure my audio is working okay. I have the issue of, if I don't have it spaced properly, you get this feedback. Yeah, you don't want that. So, I have to make sure it's close enough that you can pick up my voice, but far enough away that it's not like picking up my breathing through my nose. I mean, the alternative is I turn into a mouth breather, but nobody wants that.
So, when do I get my own Padawan? Always wanted to be a teacher.
When you become a master.
It's true. I'm learning all kinds of things from you.
Helps that you're an excellent student, but that's not what I mean. Here, pretend you're my Padawan. Got a hypothetical moral dilemma for you.
Okay.
Say you could only save the Republic or the Jedi Order. Which would you choose and why? Don't think. Answer.
We're all that prevents the Sith from conquering the galaxy. Without us, there'd be no Republic.
Excellent answer, my Padawan. Have a sweet flat cake. See? I'd make a nifty master. Learn from the best, after all. Finally got the skinny on how we become an official Jedi twosome. Short version, not happening.
There you go.
We'd only ever see each other on Tython. Senior council members would review us monthly.
Okay.
Make sure we stay detached.
I mean, that's fair.
Clincher is, only Jedi who were raised by the Order from birth get permission. I'm automatically disqualified.
What? Why? Why would that be a thing? Only Jedi were raised by the Order from birth.
We can do what we want. We don't need permission.
Maybe not, but we might need a good ally someday. Master SWTOR, smart lady. The longer we keep things going,
I'll just invite her in.
Stop. Not gonna ruin your life, tough guy. You want out of this? Just say so.
Don't make me decide everything. This affects both of us.
Gonna make me say it, aren't you? Fine. I love you, dummy. Always will. I don't want this to end. There, happy?
Just needed ears to say the words. And I love you too.
Jesus Christ, dude.
Funny when I say it.
They're so cringy. Alright, you know how like Anakin was like super cringy in episode 2? Alright, everybody called it bad acting and everything, and I mean, it probably was bad dialogue and acting. But also, Jedi probably are just really fucking cringy when it comes to romance. You think about it, like most of their life they're celibate. They're not normal, like, people in terms of the way they socialize and whatnot. They probably are just fucking weird to flirt with and whatnot. Hey. Gentle. So much for upholding the Jedi Code. Guess we're outlaws. I should have said like.
Won't be easy, but we have to try and try and try.
Jesus Christ. This gives me a negative boner. My penis actually goes back in.
Nope, still feel guilty.
Now, if my penis goes back in, does that count as me fucking myself?
Better get back to saving the galaxy. Don't want people to think we've gone soft.
I mean, you guys are making me incredibly soft right now. Then, did I run out of companions to talk to? Travel to Korriban's flame. Go.
Good work.
Hey, Alex, how's it going?
How's it going? Nice to meet you.
Sage.
Why don't you just begin? Why is suffering or evil make God's existence unlikely? I think when confronted.
This is Station Korriban's flame to unidentified vessel. You have violated Imperial space. Submit your security clearance or be destroyed.
Stand down, you ignorant fool. I'm here on the Emperor's orders.
Transmitting clearance code now.
Stand by while I... We're so pleased you're here, Grand Moff. You'll find our security airtight.
Is unlikely.
I've cleared a docking bay for you. Please proceed with your landing, sir.
Cleared that pretty quickly. Hey, out of there. 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 Out. Hold on. Out of there. Go. Get. Okay. For a moment, they believed I am Grand Moff Resh. This ruse will not hold. Prepare to kill everyone. Okay. But who will I interrogate? This should be necessary.
Killing everyone might make finding out what's happening here a little difficult.
Cripple those you think possess information. Kill the rest. Don't waste any time. Destroy the enemy while we have the elements of surprise.
Confronted with two hypotheses, so atheism, naturalism, or theism, we should ask what we expect would occur under either hypothesis. And then we look at the world and we see what does actually occur. And what do we find? We find, I think most relevant here, a system of natural selection, the mechanism by which God apparently chose to bring animals and ultimately human beings into existence. A system which is defined by suffering. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and suffering and destruction of the unfit. I'm told that the very mechanism that God chose to bring about the human species as the ultimate end of his creation was one that is imbued with suffering, such that 99.9% of all the species, let alone animals, that have ever existed on planet Earth have been brutally wiped from existence into extinction. And I think that that's less likely on theism. If you assume atheism or materialism, not only do you explain this, you also come to expect it.
What is your epistemology? How do you know that this is the case, that it's less likely, and that an atheist worldview, a naturalistic worldview would look like the way it is today?
Of course we don't know, but that's why I use the phraseology of unlikely. I think that if you were to tell somebody who was sort of in some Rawlsian state of nature, hadn't seen the world, and you said that the world has been created by an omnibenevolent, all-powerful God, what kind of world would that person be imagining? And if you dropped them into the world, if you were given the opportunity to become a wild animal, like in 2 seconds, I was just going to turn you into a random wild animal somewhere on planet Earth. I
like being a guy.
I think you'd probably kill yourself before I had the opportunity, because you know that the life of these animals is almost defined in terms of their suffering.
I guess I just don't really see how you can justify that claim per se. What I would say is that if we actually take into account the holistic view of the scriptures, which I do think that you have to do, we see that it's actually much more coherent once you acknowledge that evil itself doesn't have ontology. Evil's not a thing. You don't look under a rock and say, there's the evil, right?
Fine by me. So I'm not really talking about evil here, because that's, of course, a moral term. I'm talking about suffering.
Can you distinctualize suffering and evil?
So evil is a moral term. Evil means that something is bad, it's immoral. You need to have a moral ontology for that. Suffering is just any experience that's not wanted when experienced, right? And so even if you don't have a moral objectivism, you can still say that suffering exists. So here's a question. A deer gets its leg caught under the branch of a tree that's fallen over in the wild, and it starves to death in confused agony. Why does God oversee this? And why does God set the natural world up such that events like this occur?
Well, because the ultimate view here is that...
Okay, pause.
Oh, man. This format. I would have liked to hear that answer. That's interesting.
Good work.
Alice and man.
How's it going?
Well, I mean,
okay, so my first question to start off with is, what exactly about suffering makes this unlikely on the condition that God exists?
I think that if God is all-loving, then he probably wouldn't want his creatures to suffer. And so I think that the fact that they do suffer makes his existence less likely.
Okay, perfect. And is there some specific aspect of suffering that you're particularly honing in on, horrendous or whatever
in particular, non-human animal suffering? Because I think that the Christianity has a celebrated tradition of theodicies trying to explain why suffering exists. Yeah. Human free will, the development of the soul, higher order goods, all of this kind of stuff, none of which apply to the suffering of non-human animals.
That's a interesting formulation of that argument. Because it's an old argument. Hold on.
I applied the right stimulus, you couldn't resist coming here.
Something's wrong with Leha. She's not herself. She tricked me.
Jomar was chasing proof you'd fallen to the dark side. He fell into my trap like a greedy child. You were just as easy.
I need information on the Emperor's plans. I'm guessing you can help.
Please, don't hurt her. She doesn't know what she's doing.
Poor boy. You think you love me, but what we shared in secret on Tython was only a shadow of true passion.
They indulged their base desires. Impressive.
That's impressive. It's their base desires.
Jomar. But first things first.
I don't want to hurt you. If you care about Jomar, surrender.
Surrender is for the weak. Jomar had that option. You don't. You remember the meaties? I gave my little droid friends a few upgrades I think you'll enjoy. Briefly.
These little robots, I'm supposed to be intimidated by these. Lord Scourge has been alive 300 years. He couldn't defeat a robot on his own. Okay. Let's see what she got to say for herself.
Stop! 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 Where are we?
Leha, it's me. You're going to be all right.
My poor droids. How did we get here?
You've been under the Emperor's control. You tortured Jomar and tried to kill me.
No. That's not possible. No. I can feel the Emperor's presence. He hates you. The things he made me do.
Come home to Tython. Master SWTOR will help you. I have no right to ask you for anything, but the Council doesn't need to know about us. Please, keep our relationship to yourself.
There's a war on. I don't care about your indiscretion.
Thank you. I'm sorry for all of this. I was wrong about you. My mission wasn't a total failure. I overheard Leha delivering orders from the Emperor to a high-ranking Sith Lord. I couldn't hear details, but I know someone named Lord Fulminus went on a secret mission to the planet Voss.
Lord Fulminus? The Emperor isn't taking any chances with Voss.
I'll take Leha home. Thank you for saving her. Us.
Is that it? Are we doing anything else on Korriban, or? Gotta be more, right? Yeah, that whole vision about his crew and pain and suffering. Oh, that was on Korriban, because that was on the station, right? I believe. Damage?
Report your ailments. You are fit for duty. Return to your post.
Have you heard of the axiological expectation mismatch problem?
I have not.
Oh, what is this? Okay, refers to the situation where there's a discrepancy between what someone expects to be good or valuable and what they actually observe in the world, leading to a sense of conflict or dissonance. Oh, okay.
Okay, so philosophers of religion have started to understand that the thing that actually generates a problem between God and suffering is actually the value system you attach to the very attribute of perfect lovingness. Because the problem of evil is an...
I mean, yes, but you like way over intellectualize it. All you're really saying is that there's a discrepancy between what you believe to be, you know, good and bad, what your normative values are intrinsically, or you know, from your nature versus what the values purported in the Bible or the book are. It was just a very like elaborate way of saying that.
Master Satil, I rescued Jomar and found Liha Nerez. She's been under the Emperor's control and needs your help. They're headed for Tython now. I also learned a high-ranking Sith named Fulman.
That is disturbing news. Voss was discovered only recently. Its society is dangerously unbalanced.
Oh god, here we go again. Voss.
A group of Force users who rule with absolute authority. Despite our best efforts, Voss's government rejects the Jedi Code.
The Emperor has always taken a great interest in that world. I thought he sought to conquer it, but clearly he intends its destruction.
Go to Voss, find Lord Fulminus, and stop his plans.
This is Jomar Chul. I wanted to thank you again for saving Liha, and I appreciate you keeping our relationship to yourself. I'm helping her recover from what happened. It's slow going, but she's making progress.
Is that what you call it? Helping her recover?
I consider you a true friend.
Why? Because I kept your stupid secret? I'm your friend now? Okay. What is this? What's this? Oh, it was on Belsavis. Okay. Sorry. You guys are gonna have to help yourself. That one. Okay, I can't remember. What is it Voss and then it's Quesh? What is the order here? Let's see. Jedi Knight. Story order? Oh. Quesh, then Hoth, then Belsav, then Boss. Okay, and then that should be... Oh, and then we go to Corellia. Have we gone to Ilum with any of these characters yet? I don't think so, right? I think Corellia is the last in like the original release of the game. I think Ilum is like the start of the next DLC. Let's see. Was Corellia in the original release? No. Okay. Oh, that's not what I meant. It's in the original release of TOR. Corellia was included in the original release of TOR. Yeah. Okay. Game first launch was Ilum. Ilum might have been the first DLC planet. Wait, Ilum was? Why?
Internal critique, you have to look at a very specific version.
Okay, despite their claims to fear the mystics have more in common with the Sith than us, they don't really. But what do you mean?
Are you saying the Voss are servants of the dark side?
The mystics use the visions given to them by the Force to control the lives of ordinary citizens. Like the Sith, they use their power to dominate others.
The mystics are prophets who shape the direction of Voss society. The Emperor wants to wipe out all life in the galaxy. Hardly the same thing.
The dark side is subtle and insidious, as you well know. The Emperor did not begin his conquest of the galaxy by declaring his true intentions.
They don't sound so bad. I don't even know anything about them.
We haven't uncovered the Emperor's plan to destroy Voss yet, but he recently dispatched a Sith Lord named Fulminus to this system.
Lord Fulminus created the Harrowers you faced in the Emperor's fortress. Be wary.
The Harrowers were twisted beings of pure evil.
The dark side has the power to corrupt life itself. Fulminus is a master at manipulating evolution to create unimagined horrors.
We know Fulminus is somewhere on Voss. He's communicating with the Emperor through an encrypted communications relay. We've detected several signal scramblers outside the planet's capital city of Voss-Ka. Disable them, and we can track the comm signal to his location.
Fulminus wouldn't just leave those scramblers undefended.
The signal scramblers were hidden deep inside the savage.
Out of there.
Reaching them will be dangerous.
Out of there.
If you act quickly, you should be able to disable all the scramblers before Fulminus knows what's happening. Then we can find him. May the Force be with you.
The hell is this? Oh, this is on Voss? Hey, get out of there. Out. Jesus Christ. Very honorary today.
Of theism and how it defines perfect lovingness. I want to present to you a version where my version of perfect lovingness does not actually constitute a problem and a misalignment, that mismatch between the suffering of animals, let's just say the profusion of suffering of animals and the existence of God.
So let's hear it. What kind of God are we imagining that would allow and oversee and do nothing to prevent billions of years of untold animal suffering?
Right, so you're talking about non-prevention.
Or setting up the system that is natural selection such that it relies upon things like predation and disease.
Well, the first part is I don't agree with the whole setting up the system part. So I'm not one of those theists that believes that God does this select and pick idea of creating worlds. I don't think that God actually creates worlds. I think that God lets worlds develop according in a certain way.
This is an interesting point. So, this is something that I've thought about in the past. This is similar to, this is also part of the Epicurean paradox. So they talk about, you know, if God chooses, like, where does evil come from? If God chooses to create a world that has evil, right? And the roundabout way out of that usually is to say, oh, you know, evil or hate or pain is the absence of God. And that, you know, it's not really that God creates these things, it's that these are things that are, I guess, choosing or don't have God's will, God's intention in them, right? But I don't think that this is accurate, because if you're going to assert that God is the creator, right? He therefore would have created a system that is able to, you know, have evil, have pain, have suffering, right? Even if you say, oh, well, he just kind of created it and then he just kind of let it do its own thing, right? That would be like me putting a tarantula and a rat in a cage and then being surprised that the tarantula ate the rat and then going, oh, well, you know, I didn't do it or anything, you know, I just put them in there and they developed and they decided to do whatever they wanted to do. Okay, you created that scenario. You created the conditions that would lead to that, right? And especially if you are a god, you're not ignorant of what the outcome is going to be. You know what the outcome is going to be. In fact, many theologians or theists or whatever, believe that God's omniscient, in which case you can't say that he didn't create the system to be that way. He knew it was going to be that way, right? Well, let's see how this guy gets
But because
out of it.
God can oversee an overarching narrative, he knows exactly how he can redeem anything. The first time, sorry, go ahead.
Could God have made it such that animals were all herbivores instead of carnivores and omnivores?
Yes, he could totally do that.
Okay, so had he done that, here's an instant way to reduce by orders of magnitude the amount of suffering that exists.
Right, but hold on. That's particularly assuming a value theory already that I haven't told you I'm adopting that has a problem with the evil. So I have to give you my value theory first for you to show that misalignment.
Okay, let's hear it.
Perfect. Okay, so my value theory says that it's not the most important thing about a sentient creature is not what merely happens to them. It's about the total timeline of their life and how and where their life permanently ends. Meaning, if you were to judge an author of a narrative and the first few chapters, let's say, there's a lot of bad things happening, but the end ends with this crescendo where there's victoriousness, there's redemption, there's beauty, and everyone in the story actually endorses their entire existence that they live. They can look at their they can look at their total timeline, and they actually each subjectively come to the conclusion, I'm glad I was made, and I totally see what my suffering was for. That's the particular I'm using with. So we have to judge, hold on, like John Hicks says, we have to judge the very nature of God's lovingness by what he does in the end, not these few time slices that we observe right now. For you to show that there's a problem, you have to show to me that the suffering of animals cannot be transformed, are intrinsically cut off from being transformed into a life that they will endorse. There's a couple of theses on the table, but sure, go ahead.
Okay, so are you talking about the end of their life is in their end of life on Earth, or are you talking about the afterlife?
I'm antemortem, postmortem.
Because if you're just talking about life on Earth, then I would say that if you had an author writing a book and a character, if we were trying to figure out the relationship between that author and the person in the book, and that person in the book shows up for 5 seconds in the first chapter and is a child who almost immediately dies of cancer in an incredibly painful way, and there's no development, there's no sort of bringing back to life, and suddenly everyone...
It's a good counter argument, right? Because the other guy, he was trying to basically make the case that, you know, if you're looking at pain and suffering kind of as a, you know, in the moment, maybe what you're not saying, right, that might justify that later on is God works in mysterious ways, right? Maybe you had to suffer so that you can learn a lesson or something along those lines, right? And you look at what, you know, what do they wind up at the end of this journey that they take? Not just, you know, temporary moments of pain and suffering, but, you know, what is the, I don't know, what is the catharsis at the end, right? But Alex O'Connor's making the case that you have babies, you have infants, you have children who experience pain and suffering without ever having some sort of like redemptive experience that makes up for that, right? That's a really good counter argument to this position that the other guy posed.
It is just this miserable, tragic experience. And I asked, well, what did the author not want to do for the story of the book, but want to do for that character?
Yes.
I think it would be pretty damning. And also, when it comes to animals, we're talking about animals who are predated on from the moment that they begin existence.
Absolutely.
They sort of have disease. You know, zebras, when they're killed by lions, are often too big to be killed instantly, so they die over minutes with their windpipes caught in the jaws of a lion. How can this be developing a zebra, which, by the way, probably doesn't even have the same kind of first-person conscious experience that humans do in order to sort of rationalize and abstract and learn from their sort of...
You know, I was going to give Alex O'Connor props and everything for, you know, it was a good rebuttal or good counter question to that position that guy raised. But then he said zebra, and he reminded me that he's British, and now I just don't really know, you know.
Of past and morally develop in that way, they just suffer. And what kind of God could oversee this?
Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions on the table again. Again, you're assuming a particular value system that I'm not laying
I'll tell you what
out.
I'm assuming here. What I'm assuming here is that a good God would not allow unnecessary suffering to obtain.
Okay, gotcha. So we can talk.
Do you agree with that?
We can talk about unnecessary suffering. We're talking about the justifying norms for suffering. You're saying it has to be in terms of necessity, which is an evil is only authorizable by God if it's in connection to a greater good or prevention of a greater evil. Correct?
If there's some kind.
I would not grant that argument, by the way, right? Because I would make the point that if God is omnipotent, right, why is he even required to have beings experience pain and suffering before they get whatever kind of redemptive experience that they have, right? He doesn't have to set it up that way either, right? I suppose the counterclaim to that could always just be, well, you know, you don't understand his grand design. He works in mysterious ways. I don't know if you'd call that special pleading, but at that point, you're basically making an argument that I can never defeat, because you're not really making an affirmative argument. Really, you're just saying, well, who knows? That's essentially what you're doing. Well, who knows? If that's the case, then I might as well say, well, who knows, like, for the rest of the debate. myself, because then we don't ever have to actually stake out anything that we have to defend. We can just keep saying like, well, I don't know, who knows? Well, why are you even here to debate then? If you don't know, then don't why are you here to debate it? My God, my cat is shedding a lot lately. Kind of curious if like it's a seasonal thing. I don't feel like she was. Well, I guess that makes sense. She wouldn't have been shedding like this during the winter. Or maybe it's a dietary thing. Maybe I can be feeding her something or giving her some kind of supplement to keep her from shedding as much as she is. But it's kind of annoying, you know, constantly sweeping, constantly moving her hair off of my desk and whatnot. You're shedding everywhere. What are you doing? Your hair's falling out. Kind of curious. I'm gonna look this up actually. Let's see here. Siamese seasonal shedding. Siamese cats shed, yeah, with increased shedding typically occurring spring and autumn. Okay, makes sense. So we're kind of at the tail end of spring though, right? Kind of moving into the summer months. Can I control Siamese shedding? Yes, you can definitely influence help manage shedding. While they are known for their short, smooth, and generally lower shedding compared to many other breeds, a balanced diet and addressing any underlying health issues. So she's healthy, her diet's good. High quality protein. A diet rich in quality protein is crucial for healthy hair and coat growth. Look for food that contains a high percentage of protein on a dry matter basis. Okay, I'm pretty sure. I mean, I use Purina 1, which is always, you know, I've kept seeing it pop up on like, the list of like dry foods as far as like one of the better ones. But I haven't really dived into the nutritional facts, so maybe there's another brand that has a higher protein content. Sure, your cat's getting all necessary vitamins and minerals through the diet to support coat health. Okay, well, which vitamins and minerals? Consider supplements. I guess perhaps it could be an allergic reaction, but what would it be? I feel like I'd see other signs of like an allergic reaction, like her scratching a lot or like her skin turning red, but she doesn't really seem to have that issue. Could be stress. I mean, I'm not home for like 8 hours a day when I'm at work. So, I mean, I guess I do need to look for a new cat or another cat. I was gonna say companion for her. I think I might do that this weekend. So maybe that'll help keep her comfortable and calm. Or maybe on the flip side, I'll just have two cats shedding a lot. They do shed about as much as you'd expect for cat minimum, but de-shedding them really feels optional. I always wonder if like grooming your cats really makes a difference, because like aren't they just gonna shed anyways even after you groom them? I don't know. But maybe I should just get a shedding tool. Can I just stick her in a vacuum? No, I'm just kidding, that'd probably be dangerous to do. Double coat probably, and they resist impression. I like this. Mine sheds like it's her job and she's seeking her promotion. It's pretty funny.
Kind of justification for allowing that.
Yeah, but you're saying it's a necessary connection. Why you say, what's the term of necessity?
So perhaps I should say unjustified instead of unnecessary.
Okay, so we both agree. I do not believe that God can authorize justified or unjustified suffering.
Tell me how that example that I gave you, the deer with its leg starving, is justified.
Because it's intrinsically redeemable, and the norms I'm working with is not this necessity condition that you're working with. Mine is about redeemable suffering, redeemability, or we call it defeasibility. If that suffering can be defeated within the creature's life, and I'll define what I mean by defeat, which is that they can retroactively look back at what they went through and integrate it into their life history, where they look at their life.
I have to interrupt because the example I gave you is one where the deer dies.
Yes, the deer dies. But here's the thing. You're probably talking about this post-mortem example. Sure. I'm going to put one thesis on the table. There's two philosophers that defend exactly what this goes through. One defends that animals will be given a martyrdom status, while God will be able to present himself in a way to animals in the afterlife.
But you don't know this, so you're just making this kind of stuff up, right?
Such that in the same way you could give praise to a dog, and the dog emotionally recognizes that he's loved and that his life is worth living, right? To these animals.
Also, the more fundamental question, which is the point that I was going to make, I don't concede this point because there's really no reason to concede this point. Why? I mean, why are you even doing that in the first place? Why would God have? It's not like God has to do that. He's choosing to do that, right? Oh, the deer has to suffer a lot in order for me to love him in the afterlife. Why? Why are you doing that? It's kind of weird.
That suffered like that, there's one view on the table, which is that God will give them a praiseworthy status where they will be able to actually see that.
Can we talk about that claim? Because these animals...
Yes, please. I'm curious what his rebuttal is going to be, but yeah, imagine you make me God, oh, hey, you know what, I'll definitely, let you chill with me and the rest of the cool kids in heaven and stuff, but, first you gotta let me, mince your balls for, 5 hours. Sound like a deal? Right? I don't know. Why are you doing that?
Suffering for what? I mean,
exactly.
God might cause them to suffer.
Yes. For what? It's like an arbitrary, arbitrary reason to suffer. How do I find these dye modules? I feel like I can never find where they're where they have them on here. Color crystal barrel. Oh no, see I can't find them that way. I'll just do dye module. And honestly, it might just be his armor. This armor just does not seem conducive to dyes. Dyes don't really seem to produce good results. I do like that green though. What green is it? It's like a dark green. Dark green, okay. Blue on blue is a little bit too much. He's already very blue. See, I kept running into this green, and this green was a little bit too, I think, too bright for him, my character. Deep green, interesting. Interdasting. Deep orange and blue. Oh. I think really it's just time to upgrade to a different
God might cause them to suffer a bunch and then essentially redeem them in the afterlife. But what for?
Why?
Why do this? If I were to punch you in the face and then give you $20,000 afterwards, you might be grateful for the $20,000, but why couldn't I just give you the $20,000?
Well, see, so that's assuming. So I saw your debate with Trent.
You've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seat.
Good stuff.
Let him. That's very interesting line of inquiry.
Ooh. So close. Hey.
Nice to meet you. My
How's
name's
it?
Hayden. How are you?
Hayden. Nice to meet me.
Would you say that theism or atheism better account for the idea that suffering exists and a purpose for it?
Depends exactly what you mean, because of course you might say that the world itself is more expected on theism, and since suffering needs the existence of the world, that it's theism. But granted the existence of a material world, let's say, I think atheism.
Okay. Why does suffering exist at all? In an atheistic worldview, what is the cause of suffering?
Oh, well, because however life began, it developed through a series of natural selection, which requires animals to develop senses that they wish to avoid in order to be more likely to survive. And that's why pain receptors evolve in a world where not all of these pain...
He had a good argument, ready to go. See, on the fly, I wasn't really thinking of a good counter argument to this, but yeah, he had a really... I don't know if that's... I don't watch too much of Alex O'Connor's stuff, so I don't know if that's just because he's had this debate a lot. But yeah, making that one up on the fly is pretty good. Props for that.
Pains are actually going to kill us. We're left with situations in which we're in a lot of pain but don't end up dying for it.
Would you agree that consciousness is necessary for suffering?
I would say probably, yeah.
Does atheism account for consciousness?
Yes, that's what I was talking about a moment ago. Perhaps not. Maybe theism accounts better for consciousness than atheism does.
So if there is no consciousness, there is no suffering. Is that right?
That's probably true, yeah.
So if atheism cannot account for consciousness, then it cannot account for suffering. Would you agree with that?
So I think what we're doing here is we're sort of slightly shifting the goalposts. If you don't want to grant the existence of the material world before we start talking about this, we can do an argument from consciousness, but then we need to debate whether consciousness is explicable on atheism. What I'm going to say is this.
Sure.
Here's what my counter argument would be. I don't know if Alex Connor make the same counter argument. You know, if you're going to argue that atheism can't account for consciousness because we can't solve that problem, like in a scientific sense, you know, we still struggle to really define and measure what consciousness is, right? I follow a subreddit that talks about basically consciousness, and there's been some interesting theories. One of them is that basically consciousness is operating like on a separate dimension than the other dimensions that we typically measure things on. That's, I think, my view, is that I think what you're getting is intersection of dimensions in the same way that you, or maybe that's not a good way of putting it, but in the same way that you have like intersecting planes in mathematics, and where those planes intersect produces a shape, right? And I imagine that what we see, what we feel, what we think in our consciousness is the intersection of some sort of extra dimensional plane. The question would be, though, is that plane generated by consciousness, or is that plane generating the consciousness, right? And that's even taken for granted that that's even how consciousness even works to begin with. But anyways, my counter argument would be, all right, atheism doesn't really account for consciousness, right? But we have a lot of ways of, I think we do a much better job than religion or Christianity is going to be able to, because religion and Christianity is just going to assert that you have a soul and just assert things about consciousness. Well, if that's the level that you're operating on, that very surface level of simply just asserting a thing to be true, well, atheism can also just simply assert to know about consciousness, right? But atheism goes one step further, which is that with its reliance on science and empiricism and whatnot, we're able to actually look at things like, you know, putting electrical stimulation through the brain and seeing what a person's response to that will be. We can, you know, send electrical signals to the brain and have, you know, someone move their fingers as a result involuntarily, just because we've triggered certain regions of the brain. We could do things like we could trigger, would be like I believe that we're able to do things like trigger the sensation of like certain smells, I believe, or tastes in the brain, right? And so atheism is able to look at, okay, we're able to look at actually producing a correlation between things that we could describe in the physical world and the experience of consciousness. We haven't been able to, like, in a very solid way, connect those two, right? But we can see that when we do something in the physical world with the brain, we're able to see a response that correlates to conscious experience. So if anything, atheism is better at explaining consciousness than religion is. So I'm curious if Alex O'Connor is going to use this argument.
I'm going to say this. Consciousness may seem to imply the existence of a conscious creator of the universe. We're here talking about, I suppose we're talking about Christianity, and the claim was about God. But the God that you believe in, let's say, if we grant that there is a creator deity who sort of brings about the universe of conscious creatures, have you ever heard of the evil God hypothesis that Stephen Law popularized or came up with?
Tell me it.
So the idea is that, like, imagine that there's a God who brings about the world and creates the world, but does it maliciously because he wants human beings to suffer. He brings about a world in order so that human beings will suffer. Right? That seems like a plausible hypothesis. And even if you think that consciousness points towards God, the kind of God that a lot of Christians think is a sort of necessary quality of God, which is to be all-loving, might not have to apply here.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
If Christianity were true,
What if you said no?
is it plausible that suffering is necessary for God's purpose, for
If
his
Christianity
creation?
is true, then I think it must be necessary, because there'd be no other explanation.
Okay, so we're
for
not talking about whether or not Christianity is true.
But if you're asking me if it's plausible that Christianity is true and therefore suffering is necessary, I would say probably not, because I don't think suffering should be necessary or could be necessary.
In an atheistic worldview, I would agree with you. It makes no sense at all. But okay, I would ask this question.
So can I ask you why then, if God exists and wants to come to know everybody, and wants to love everybody and does so for the sake of human beings, why he chose to imbue the world with so much suffering that is at least seemingly completely inexplicable.
Are you a father?
No.
I'm a father. I want my son to become just like I am, better than I am, I should say. I want him to become the best that he can be. Is it possible for him to reach his potential without suffering in his life?
Perhaps not, but there's
so suffering is necessary.
There are a few things I want
to... Okay, but when he says that suffering is necessary because that is the way that God had set it up. We're dodging the question, which is, why would God need to set it up that way in the first place, right? You're already kind of, how do I put it? The question is, why would God need to set it up that way? You're just saying, well, he did set it up that way, therefore I'm doing this, right? You don't have the option as a father to change the entire world to make it such that you don't have to induce suffering or have someone experience suffering or adversity in order to adapt to the world. Because that's really what he's saying, is that I want to raise my child so that they're adapted to a world that has suffering that exists within it, right? But the question is, okay, if you were a god, you would just redesign the world. You wouldn't need to put your child through that. You don't have to design the world that way in the first place. There wouldn't really be the need to have them adapt to that world.
to say here. Firstly, that kind of moral development doesn't apply to non-human animals, as I've already said, right? That does not account for the brutal death of animals in the wild. Also, if I don't want to talk about your son because it's tragic to think about, but somebody else's son has suffered and died immediately as a result of that suffering, they don't get to develop in the same way.
I would agree that on a micro level, it's very hard to justify, and we can ask the question, why doesn't God intervene on all of these sufferings?
You might be able to justify an amount of suffering. Yeah. Right? But the fact that there's so much gratuitous suffering in the world is what I think makes God's existence unlikely. There are some instances where maybe a certain amount of suffering brings about a certain amount of good in a situation. That, by the way, would count as a justification. But when a child dies of leukemia,
this pale red.
And they're dead.
Could there be a purpose to it? What if the death of the child
I think the onus is on you
their
to
parents
explain
to
what
God?
that purpose
then perhaps then the parents should be grateful that their child got leukemia because it's doing the will of the Lord.
Not necessarily.
That seems
All right,
obscene
pause.
to me.
No.
Please
awesome.
return to your seat.
You're so cool.
They say you're so cool. That's pretty nice.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm awesome.
I just wasn't
I
expecting.
would love to
you.
pull back a little bit.
Sure.
And ask you, what are your values kind of rooted in and grounded in? Where would we start with that?
So I'm an ethical emotivist, which is a form of ethical non-cognitivism. I don't think that ethical claims have truth value. I think they're expressions of emotion.
If we're pulling back a little bit, I remember reading at the end of Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, that we can't trust our senses because evolution doesn't really care about making truth claims. It cares about surviving.
I don't know.
Do you agree with that?
I don't think Dawkins actually endorsed that argument, but it's a good argument. C.S. Lewis, Alvin Plantinga, the argument from reason, sure.
But would you agree or disagree with that?
Well, I mean, I remain agnostic on what reason is, but I think it's a powerful argument.
When it comes to determining if suffering is wrong or right.
So, okay, so crucially, I'm not saying that suffering is morally wrong. Outside of the senses that I, as an emotivist, will just express an emotion towards it, that I don't like it. I'm not claiming that it's immoral, that it's objectively bad. What I'm claiming is that suffering is unexpected on theism. It's an internal critique, right? Lincoln said of slavery, if this is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. You don't have to believe that something's wrong, but if there is such a thing as objective morality, I don't think that it would consist in a God who oversees the amount of suffering that we have on planet Earth.
Timothy Keller does this story about no-see-ums. Have you heard of the no-see-um story?
No.
Yeah, so he says if you have a tent and you look in there and you say, hey, I think I have some dogs in the tent. Maybe, like, for example, I have a golden doodle. He's a killer. That was just a joke, but we can move on. And if I say, hey, I have a golden doodle inside the tent, you would expect to see one. But if I said, hey, there's some no-see-ums. These little gnats are so tiny they actually go through the screen.
Sure.
He says, there's some no-see-ums in the tent. You might look in there and go, I don't see any no-see-ums. But of course you don't see no-see-ums because nobody can see them.
Okay, so
just because there's maybe not a reason that we can identify doesn't mean that there can't be a reason. Now, it's
sure, and I agree with you on that point, but the onus is on you to defend why you're making an assertive claim, right? That things needed to be this way. So the onus is on you to say that, because otherwise, right? What's the flip side of this argument? We can all just say this, right? If we're presenting two competing perspectives of the world, every time you think you've got me in some sort of logical pretzel or issue or flaw in my perspective, I could just say, well, we just don't know, right? We just don't know. Nobody knows. Who knows? Who knows why, right? We can just do this, and then what's the point of even having a discussion in the first place? What's the point of even asserting one worldview versus the other at that point?
It's kind of cold comfort that doesn't get us 100% of the way there, but it gets us part of the way there.
That's true. So the existence of evil is not logically, or suffering is not logically incompatible with God's existence. But it's a bit like if somebody came up to me right now and stole my friend's wallet in front of me and shot him dead and ran away, and I was grieving, and somebody said to me, well, hey man, you don't know, that person might have worked for the CIA, and your friend might have secretly been harboring the nuclear codes, and killing him might have been good for the country, and he stole the wallet because that's what the codes were. And I would say, well, what evidence do you have for that? And you say, well, look, just because I don't have evidence for it doesn't mean that there might not be some evidence that I don't know about. I would say, until I see why I should think that's the case, I'm not going to believe it. And I'm certainly not going to be less upset in my grieving over my friend because of the possibility that there could be an explanation for it. There's so much suffering imbued in the human experience that if somebody says, well, look, there could be an explanation, it's like, okay, fine, but let me know when you know what it is.
Exactly.
I think that's
All right, pause. You've been voted out by the majority.
Or if he came up
Please
with that on
return
the
to your
flyer,
seats.
he's had that argument before, and so he like, had it ready to go in his back pocket.
Hello.
Hey, nice to meet you. How are you?
Good. Repeat your claim one more time.
That suffering is unexpected if a good God exists.
Unexpected. So when you say unexpected, like you're caught off guard by it, or you're expecting like all good things to happen over
That if I assume that there is a good God supervising, invigilating the universe, that I would not expect to see so much suffering.
Right.
So much gratuitous, seemingly unnecessary suffering.
Right. And you know, the most beautiful thing is that our God is not unfamiliar with suffering as he suffered himself. So would you say that there is like some beauty in suffering in some way?
No.
I would say that there can be sort of
So
poetically.
my argument for this would be that I think we as humans, we try to rationalize that we do live in a world that does have suffering by trying to find meaning and, beauty in it, so to speak. But the reality is that it's not really. It's our way of coping with it. And you know what? I'm not even saying that's wrong. I think that given that we do live in the reality that we do live in, we try to make the most of it. And so, yeah, we do try to find meaning where we can. And that's like a good way to kind of psychologically deal with it. But was it necessary? I don't think so. Right? Or is it like intrinsically beautiful? I don't think so. I think that's just something we kind of added meaning into it. Again, I'm just kind of repeating myself, but you get my point. Let's see, do we color match it or no? I mean, it's fine without, but even if we do, it's not bad either. We're gonna leave it off. Get rid of some of that crap in my shared cargo drive. I mean, same thing here. I have too much junk in here as well. Looks good. Liking the way it looks. Pale red didn't look bad, but everything looked kind of faded, like my clothing. Looking fresh. Yeah. Alright, onward ho. Let's get back to my ship.
You can look at suffering and think that's a beautiful story, but I don't think that the person suffering, especially if they die as a direct result, might think that. Also, I think that if I knew someone whose child died of leukemia and suffered for it,
right,
and I went to them and said, but hey, there's some beauty in the suffering, isn't there? I think I'd be kicked out of the
I will say though, I do appreciate
I would
that
say
Alex
like the same thing for a woman giving birth, right? It's
contentious. I've never really seen him get into like a debate bro-y adversarial conversation. He always seems to be very like polite and be able to, even with people he fundamentally disagrees with, like have like a respectful conversation. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think that's the end all be all. I think there's a lot of people that think that's the end all be all. I think in some situations you do need to like destroy someone in a debate, because there might be real world implications to that debate. Or you might be dealing with someone who's a bad faith person, and exposing them as such is useful to do, right? But there's also room, there's also utility in having these kind of discussions too that are more about people trying to actually understand each other's position without just trying to like destroy the other person. What the hell is this? What is Google Gemini? Interesting.
Suffering, like it sucks, it hurts.
Sure. But imagine you could have the giving birth without the pain of giving birth.
Right.
Would you prefer that?
Of course, yeah, you would prefer that.
So then if God can bring about the good stuff without the bad stuff,
Right.
Why
then
is he?
there's no reason to bring about the bad stuff.
Right.
So what we have to show is why the bad stuff is necessary to bring about the good stuff. Otherwise, it's not justified.
Right. Well, could you say that the result of why we suffer is because of fall of man?
I would say not, because I don't believe in the fall of man.
True.
But I also don't think that that explains non-human animal suffering. The big thing that I want to keep pressing is that the theodicies that we talk about, free will, fall of man, all of this kind of stuff,
Right.
I don't think applies to that deer with its leg caught under the branch that's dying in confused agony. What's this for?
So what is it about animals that seems so like more important than a human?
It's not that they're more
suffering?
important. It's that, as you say, like it seems plausible at least that a human can suffer and then be sort of better off for it, or that they can enjoy poetry of suffering, the
Right.
poetry of suffering. Animals can't do that.
Right.
Animals can't enjoy the poetry of suffering.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't know. I never like talked to an animal and said like, hey. Like,
I have. They just haven't. They just haven't talked back. Is the problem. But I just don't see why we would expect that God would oversee this system of
Right.
natural selection.
Right, but
Billions of animals suffering and dying, predation, disease, eating each other alive, leaving each other to bleed out on the floor, and this is being supervised by an all-loving God.
Well, do you think that's God's intention from the very beginning of creation of all things?
I think that God oversees the mechanism. God could have made it, for example,
Right.
one example that I've already given is that God could have made animals herbivores, which just eliminates the problem of predation.
I mean, there are some animals that are.
There are, but he could have made more of them. He could have made all animals herbivores, thereby eliminating the suffering of predation.
So is the issue of
Predation
them eating each other?
That's one issue. That's one way that God could have sort of, I think, quite trivially reduced the amount of suffering. David Attenborough once said of his documentaries, people who complain that we put too much violence in the documentaries should see what we leave in the cutting room floor. The animal world is just filled with unimaginable suffering. Just predation is
But there's also cute
unimaginable.
things about like, you know, otters holding hands so they
That's
don't
true.
swim away.
But could you have that without the suffering? That's the question. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Good fun.
Phew, that conversation was so interesting. It reminds me of that unfortunate time that Billy ran his unicycle into an open pothole.
Yeah, didn't he like dislocate both his arms and break his leg and even lose a tooth?
Yeah.
Sponsoring this portion of this episode.
King Saul is told.
Bring me on one of these so I can destroy all these.
Hey, how's it going? Nice to meet you.
This is a bummer of a claim, right? Like when you look at scripture, right?
I agree.
There's a myriad of problematic things we see in scripture, from genocide to misogyny to slavery, right? And I would say that we find genocide in scripture. I would argue, though.
So you agree with my claim?
Yeah, I think it's in scripture. Yeah, I mean, I think it's in there.
Okay,
right?
well, thanks for watching, everyone.
Yeah, this is good.
Yeah, good stuff.
So, I mean, but here's what I would say I ought to do with this claim as a Christian, if you're okay with entertaining that idea, right? So we see mass murder in scripture, right? And so one of my greatest friends, Rabbi Josh Stanton, he's a rabbi, the Hebrew scriptures are his. That's where we're finding these genocides, right? And
Yeah, so to spell it out, we've got, I think the two most problematic are in 1 Samuel 15, the destruction of Amalek, and in the book of Joshua, the destruction of Jericho and the destruction of Ai. So for the sake of the audience who might not know about this, in 1 Samuel, for example, the Amalekites are a Canaanite tribe. They're in the land that's been promised to Israel. Israel are instructed through the prophet Samuel. King Saul is told to completely destroy the Amalekites, leave nothing alive that breathes, kill man and woman, child and infant, cattle and sheep. And in fact, when Israel does as they're instructed, they destroy Amalek, except Saul decides to keep the king as a captive, and he also saves the best of the animals. The prophet Samuel comes to him and says, "What have you done?" And he says, "Well, we kept the best of the animals in order to sacrifice to the Lord."
I imagine when it comes to like biblical holy book stories that they're based on some sort of truth, right? Like I don't believe any of the miraculous stuff that happens. But I imagine like with Moses, for example, there's no like real historical evidence that Moses was a real person. But what I can believe is that the Jews fleeing, where are they fleeing from? Egypt, I guess, wherever the hell they were fleeing from. You know, because they were mistreated, treated as like not even second class, like really badly, right? Wait a second. This looks like Holocron. No Holocron? Okay. That when they fled, you know, they might have had all these stories regarding like that whole process of fleeing Egypt and the journeys that they went on looking for a new land to settle. You have the story about Moses parting the seas and whatnot. Like, probably what I think happens is you have like a lot of historical embellishment, and these serve as like stories that you tell the children and other people in order to like raise their spirits and give them something, to, I don't know, feel proud about, feel, inspire them, give them hope, as they're like a nomadic, people fleeing oppression and looking for a new land to settle, right? Like, don't worry, child, like we're gonna find the new promised land because, God has, he's on our side. He, gave our leader, our glorious leader, like this vision of like where to go and what to do and everything. So I think that's probably what happens is that, that you have these like fantastical stories that you tell people in order to, just give them something to inspire them and give them community and whatnot. So I think that's what happened. Where's I going with this? Just talking about the story of Amalek and people dying and whatnot. Oh, that's what I was gonna say is, imagine what is the, real basis for this story about going and like slaughtering every child and every woman and all the animals. Like, did you have someone who did this in real life, like one of the leaders of this group of people at the time, and like he went and did this? And like, you have cults today with people who follow people who are like insane and do crazy things and convince the members of their cult to go along with it, right? Like, is this one of those scenarios where you had a crazy person who actually like slaughtered a bunch of women and children and just animals too at the same time, and then somehow they got spun into like, oh yeah, we did this because God told us to do this. Like, nah, you did this because you guys are fucking crazy and you guys are following a crazy person around, you know what I mean? But imagine like trying to explain that story away. Like, oh, why did you do this? Oh, God told me. Okay. Yeah, I think this whole cult thing, like, you guys went a little bit too far for me. I think I'm gonna try to sneak my way out when you guys are all asleep. Because I was down with you guys when we were doing like little songs and dances and stuff like that in the group orgies, but I'm not really down for all this like slaughter stuff.
And it says twice that God regrets that he made Saul king. Why does he regret that he made Saul king? Because Saul didn't follow his commandment to completely destroy the Amalekites by keeping the king alive and by keeping the best of the livestock. Saul says, we kept the livestock alive to burn as a sacrifice to the Lord. Yeah. And Samuel says, what pleases the Lord more, burnt offerings or the following of his commands?
Sure.
And so we know that we're talking about what I would define here as a genocide.
Yeah. So it's in there, right? And I would say this is a great place where things like progressive Christianity serve us quite well. Not in the idea that God is progressing, but humanity is progressing further to a greater understanding of God's ethic and justice. I would also say when I look at scripture, I would actually be opposite from most of my contemporaries here. I don't read it as 100% literal. Like, I don't need scripture to be a history book, a literal book. So I look and I have to say, well, what is this telling me? And it's a awful story. Might I say a story for us to have to go through and navigate, right? And I would go back to my friend again, who is a rabbi, who we had this conversation just in friendship about how he reconciles with the Holocaust. I haven't been a part of this genocide, but he's talking about the one you're referencing in scripture, right? I wasn't around for it, but this is one that is in relatable human history that we can have family members that we're a part of, right? Yeah. And for my friend who has had this not compromise his faith, that was the question I asked him, right? Like, this is a genocide that was against your people and your religion, and for people that really loved God on a deep and a profound level. Like, how is this not shaking your faith? And for him and for me, and for many others, as you look at scripture, I mean, I think that God is ultimately always pulling us toward greater levels of justice. And when we look into this story in history, like, I think people are recording a potentially historic genocide that they are trying to make sense of in their religious worldview. And so they're superimposing language for God.
Do you think that God commanded this to happen?
I am not super interested in that conversation, but I would say
Why not?
potentially.
Okay, because for me, the problem is that if you have
Why are you avoiding
God
it? It seems like
explicitly
you're
commanding this to happen.
Okay,
I
pause.
think you're
Sounds
asking
like
the
you don't
Bible to
wanna-
do what it wasn't
Pause.
intended to do, is what I would say.
Sure. Hey, thanks.
You've been
You don't
voted
wanna
out.
address
Please
that.
return to your
Appreciate it.
seat.
I'm sitting.
Okay, if he touched it first. If he touched it first, then yes.
I need to get down the adrenaline just a little bit after that run. Yeah, I think what you bring is interesting.
things I don't like about this
think,
format
if we were to
is
look
that
at the
if you
literal
sit on
definition
one
of the Bible,
side
I
of
think we can
the
see that
circle,
God
you're closer to
commanded
the
a
chair than
person
the
to
other
commit
people.
genocide, so I think we're aligned there.
You mean the definition of genocide?
Yes.
Yeah.
So with that being said, though, I think when we look at Christian theology in the full, when Adam and Eve decide to disobey God, technically we're all, subjected to death, subjected to the wages of sin, the penalty of sin.
Even
I'm not a
that-
perfect
that
person.
alone
I
is
deserve
fucking
the worst,
insane.
right? And that's because
these people,
the only reason
thousands,
why I'm
thousands
happily
years
breathing
ago
is
did a
because
bad
Jesus
thing.
saved
Therefore,
me,
all of
right?
you are going to suffer for it.
And so when we
Fucking
look at this
insane.
pretense, like because we fell,
What do you mean
I
we?
know
What
this
is all
a
this
very
we about?
unpopular
I
thing.
wasn't there. I
God can
didn't do
do
that.
whatever He wants, right? Whether it's genocide, putting us to death. We've talked about suffering and all these things.
So can I ask you a question then?
Yes.
Suppose that you woke up tomorrow and you've been sort of transported into Canaan. And you wake up and you're a Canaanite.
Yeah.
And you think you haven't done anything particularly wrong, but you're a bad person, you're a sinner, right? And then the Israelites come knocking at the door, and you know that they've been sent by God. And they come to your door, and you say to yourself, well,
Please
I know
kill
that
me.
this is the will of God. Even though it's really horrible, God can do whatever He likes. So you say, please don't kill me, Mr. Israelite. Instead, let me first betray my family to you, because I know it's the will of the Lord. Would you allow that to happen?
I will contest it with this, right? We all fall short of the glory of God. It says that in Romans, right? So like, whatever I'm subjected to, I'm not entitled to a good life. Like
Okay.
I think even me living is a gift from God. The fact that I can talk to you is a gift.
Do you think that applies to, like, infants?
Yes. Unfortunately, yes. I know it's an unpopular opinion.
So you think infants are deserving of the treatment they're given in 1 Samuel?
I think because we all fell, yes.
I'm sorry, you've been voted out.
Sorry,
Please
ma'am.
return to
All
your
good.
seat.
Oh, so many. Good to meet you.
Hey, how's it going? Nice to meet you.
Okay, I disagree. I love to look at the case of the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15.
Sure.
So 1 Samuel 15, it says, he uses that phrase, every man, woman, child, and then the lists off the animals, right? So we presume that by the end of that, if only Agag and the animal comes back, that they're all dead.
And then they show up
Right.
later
Again,
in the chapter, yeah.
chapter 27 and in
Yep.
chapter 30. Even King Agag, his descendants come up in the book of Esther.
Yes.
Right. So like if we're saying, just for example, we have verification that there are children related to the Amalekites who must have been there because it's Agag's children, where else would they be? And they're alive because his descendants go on through Haman, which comes up in Esther. So
Yeah.
how do you reconcile
There are a few
that?
things to say. Firstly, one of the points where some of the Amalekites come up again, it's explicitly said that these are people who escaped. Right? These are people who escaped. And so it's possible that God commanded that all of Amalek was destroyed. And the word harem there means utterly destroy. That might also involve a driving out of the land. So it's possible that some of them escaped, and that's where we get the descendants from. That seems totally plausible to me. The question is, did God command a genocide? By the way, genocide includes forcible expulsion from somebody's land in a case of ethnic cleansing. What I'm looking at here is, did God
Although I
command
would
the
argue
ethnic
that
cleansing?
in modern usage of the terms, no one thinks of genocide to simply mean ethnic cleansing, and that because we have both words, then if you're not talking about the slaughter of people, you're just talking about dislocation or relocation, then it's more accurate to say ethnic cleansing, because when you say genocide, the connotation there is that you're killing a bunch of people. And to quote a bit of Wittgenstein, the whole purpose of language is that we're communicating the concepts behind the language. And so if we're using language instead to launder in connotations that aren't really accurate, then we're really not using language. Like, it's really not accurate to say that's what genocide means. I would argue, you know what? By that token, genocide doesn't really mean that, because that's just simply not how we use the word anymore. And language is how we decide to use it. How we communicate things between each other. Wittgenstein. Get out of here.
the land of Israel from people like the Amalekites, people like Ai, people like Jericho? And I think the answer is clearly yes. Like, for example, do you think that any innocent children, maybe let's not use the word innocent for theological reasons, but do you think that any infants were killed in the destruction of Amalek?
I have no idea. I don't think that it's recorded.
The signal's originating from a nearby cave. Fulminus must be inside.
Lord Fulminus is
Fulminus.
dangerous, as are his apprentices. This won't be easy.
Okay, but you think that God definitely commanded the killing of...
No, I don't think. I think that's hyperbolic phrasing. And I know I've heard you say it before. I heard you talk about this. You've heard that before, that it's hyperbole. But I think you can demonstrate it in Babylonian, Sumerian writings. Very similar.
Yeah.
There's an Egyptian stele which says that Israel was wiped out and their seed was utterly removed.
Yeah.
It was gone. And so we've got like comparable phrases used in other ancient Near Eastern communities. In their historical texts that talk very similarly, but like we know that the Jews persisted to exist in Israel, even though the Egyptians said that they were no more. And that text explicitly says man, woman, and child. That's hyperbolic language that even we used to say. Like, for example, in World War II, there's those huge posters that were put up. Every man, woman, and child is needed. Like that's, I can read that.
Okay, sure. So imagine, for example, I mean, there's a discussion at the moment about whether Israel is committing a genocide in Palestine today. Now, suppose a lot of people said, but you're killing children. And Israel said, yeah, but that's just a product of war. Imagine if we discovered that behind the scenes, Prime Minister of Israel had said, leave alive nothing that breathes. Kill everyone. Kill man, kill woman, kill child and infant. Kill the animals. Kill the donkeys. Don't leave anything alive that breathes. Even if he was trying to sort of make a hyperbolic point. The fact that children are then dying as a result, I think that we could lay some blame at his feet. Here we have God saying that. Those are the words that are recorded. Also, on the point of hyperbole, when we get into the book of Joshua and the destruction of the nation of Ai, it's explicitly said that 12,000 people died that day. All the people of Ai, it says. It does imply that some people ran away, because it says, I have it here in Joshua chapter 8, when Israel had finished killing all of the men of Ai in the fields and the wilderness where they had chased them.
Curious,
and by the way, earlier it says, not a man remained in Ai or Bethel who did not go after Israel. Because Israel sort of draw them out of the city, and they pretend to run away.
Have like this information.
Ai runs after them. It says, not a man remained in Ai. It then says, when Israel had finished killing all of the men in the fields and the wilderness where they chased them, and when every one of them had put to the sword, the Israelites turned around and returned to Ai and killed everyone who was left. If there was not a man who was left in Ai who hadn't run out and been killed in the wilderness, when they turn around and kill everyone who's left, who is it that they're killing? It's the women, it's the children. We're then told that 12,000 people fell that day, all the people of Ai, and it says 12,000 men and women. So we know that women who were non-combatants were also killed. Even if there's hyperbolic language being used here, we know that we're being told that specifically 12,000 people died, including non-combatant women.
Okay, so I think, for example, in 1 Samuel 15, these are ancient texts. It's literature, so we don't like go over and above like how interpreting literature works. So even though like the text can be saying this is what God said, well, it's still in a literary form.
Do you think God said that? Do you think it's accurate?
Well, I mean, I wasn't there. I didn't hear it. I think that the Old Testament scripture is inspired, and I think that it doesn't fail in its representation of revealing God. Like, for example, like we talked about in the New Testament, right? John chapter 2, he puts the temple expulsion moment at the beginning of his gospel. Do I think that John is actually concerned with the chronology there? No, I don't think that. I think it's a literary tool. Sure. And I think the Bible is full of that. They're literary texts, and they're assembled in a certain way. So I don't think that necessarily that means that God was the one using the hyperbole, but that the scribe recording the events and sort of summarizing what happened says, okay, so God commands to attack the Amalekites.
Taking the position that the Bible is more figurative than literal is going to be helpful to you when you're arguing, against like atheists or people who don't believe in the Bible. The problem, though, and I doubt that even Alex will bring this up, because honestly, the only reason that we never bring this up is because like we're going easy mode on Christians most of the time. But if you're going to say that the Bible is figurative, then how do you even know that the part about God himself or about Jesus is not also figurative, right? If the kind of the claims that you don't really care too much about in the Bible can be figurative, then why aren't like the major claims in the Bible also potentially just figurative? And why wouldn't you at that point just say, we treat it like a fiction book that with some tales that we have, that we relate to or we get things from? Right? You kind of pick and choose, people kind of pick and choose which parts of the Bible are figurative and which ones aren't.
Amalekites. But does that mean that God is the one who did the hyperbolizing? I don't think.
Do you think it would be problematic? You mentioned the cleansing of the temple, and you said that even though the chronology is off, the point is recorded. If we had a story of the cleansing of the temple, if we discovered some early manuscripts, some version of John, where Jesus goes into the temple, he starts cleansing the temple, flipping over tables, and then he starts beating up children, just starts punching them because he's so angry, right? What would you think of that? You'd probably think either it didn't happen, or if you could prove that it did happen, that Jesus was less moral than you thought he was, or if for some reason people believe that that's what he did, I think it'd be a problem for you. And I think that if you're looking at a good God here, the fact that even this is reported as something that he said, and this is part of the Jewish tradition that basically nobody disputes, is at least theologically accurate.
Right, but you've yet to
I think that's a
demonstrate
problem.
children being killed in the Old Testament. You haven't actually shown that. So yes, I would find that to be problematic, but you haven't shown innocent children being killed in the Old
We know that
Testament
there's the
yet.
command to kill children.
Right, but we just talked through all of that.
So, so you think God was hyperbolizing?
I think
by
the
telling
scribe is
people to kill
hyperbolizing.
innocent
I think the scribe is hyperbolizing God's command.
Okay, fine. So you think that the scribe has inaccurately recorded the command of God, therefore the Old Testament is unreliable?
Right. So like that's not the same thing though. I'm not saying the scribe made something up. I'm saying the scribe has a command.
So where did they get that command from?
From God, delivered through a prophet. So
but did God say to the prophet Samuel, "Leave alive nothing that breathes"?
I came here in search of a man named Lord Fulminus.
We have the same goal. This is a problem. I am Talaray. You wear Jedi garb. Sith's sworn enemy. We want none of your war. I search for Fulminus. Do not interfere.
We both want the same thing. Maybe we should team up.
I seek Valen Da. He is a powerful mystic. I am sworn to protect him. 3 have been seen since.
Uh-oh. Kind of curious, so I got a little pop-up said OBS disconnected then reconnected. What happens when it gets disconnected and reconnected? You know, does that mess with your stream? Does it just say, hey, your stream is temporarily down? What goes on there?
Did Lord Fulminus take Valen Da hostage?
Jedi prejudice. Valen Da left the temple willingly. You wish violence upon Lord Fulminus.
Fulminus has one goal, to wipe out all life on Voss. I will do what I must to stop him.
Your actions may harm Valen Da. That must not be. Leave.
No! Get back, you foul monsters! You want to peel the flesh from our bones!
Oh.
That's right. I'll skin you alive if you find your master.
The beasts want to feast on our innards! Kill them before they chew out our guts!
Damn.
Us monsters, mad with terror.
You know how to handle yourself in combat.
As do you. Your martial skill is impressive. Here, a holo recorder.
Welcome back, Lord Fulminus. The ritual preparations are complete. Is this boss going to be our first test subject?
Valen Da is still useful to me. The same cannot be said of you.
No! Please don't! The monsters! I can see them! They're everywhere! They're all around
I'm
me.
acting.
Fulminus destroyed the minds of his own apprentices. Now do you understand? Stopped?
There is more.
We're done here. Take me to the Shrine of Healing. The journey is long. We must go now.
This clue seems a little too convenient to have been dropped by accident.
Valen Da left the holo for me to find. Fulminus is dangerous. We must work together.
We'll have a better chance if we team up.
The Shrine of Healing is sacred, a place of ancient power. Fulminus can cause great harm there. The journey to the shrine is arduous. I will make preparations. Here, the location of my supply camp. Meet me there.
We will continue our mission.
Yeah, level 54.